It's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in science, how physical matter gives rise to subjective experience. How does the brain create consciousness? We don't know, but we are getting closer to an answer. Hi, I'm here with Minute Earth! Yeah! And it turns out that understanding consciousness might be as simple as finding where in the brain activity stops being synchronized and starts being integrated. To see how scientists are working towards solving this mystery, let's start at the beginning. Or maybe just before the beginning. Let's go back in time until we can see the very first moments of human development. Okay, there you are. You're a ball of stem cells about to become a human baby. You have all the major parts of your body, but they're all made up of undifferentiated cells. That is, they're not organized into tissues yet, if you want to get from ball of cells to fully functioning person. You need to fold, bend, and twist those cells into different shapes so they can do different things, like receive signals from your environment or release neurotransmitters. And as the brain grows, so does the complexity of these movements. Neurons extend spindly branches called axons that form connections with other neurons. These networks allow groups of neurons to communicate with each other, and over time, these networks refine their connections, becoming more efficient at sending signals. Connections are strengthened when they're used. So the networks that are most active during a particular behavior become the networks most associated with that behavior. For instance, if you practice playing an instrument, the neural connections involved in finger-foot coordination become stronger, meaning you can play better. And along the way, your brain goes from being this smooth sphere to having grooves and wrinkles. This folding increases the surface area of the brain and allows for even more connections between neurons. So now you're thinking, okay, great. But what does any of this have to do with consciousness? Well, it turns out that while the brain is developing, it goes through a phase when some of its networks become disconnected, literally it's like when the power goes out and your devices lose sync. And what happens next is kind of like turning the lights back on and everything coming back into sync. Researchers think that this reactivation is important because it allows different parts of the brain to share information. It's like when you're replaying a song on an instrument and you hear the other musicians playing their parts. Each musician is a separate network in the brain, and the song is a behavior. When they're all playing together, it's easy for them to stay in sync and keep playing the same song. But if they stop listening to each other and just keep playing their instruments, they'll eventually get out of sync and stop playing together. So in order to maintain that behavior, they need to continue integrating or keeping in sync with each other. When researchers looked at human brains, they found that this integration happened across the cortex, the wrinkly outer layer of the brain. They saw that before birth. The brain's networks were really active, but didn't show much integration. After birth, though, as the brain continued developing, they saw more integration and less activity. In other words, the brain went from desynchronized to synchronized. And this synchronization of activity is thought to be the basis of consciousness. But how does it work exactly? Well, to figure that out, let's look at another part of the brain. The thalamus is a structure deep in the brain that receives input from almost all the body's sensory systems except smell. Input from all these different senses comes in through the thalamus and then is sent to different parts of the cortex, which then sends signals back down to the thalamus. Scientists have known about this loop between the thalamus and the cortex for a long time. But more recently, they've started to understand the importance of timing. The loop between the thalamus and the cortex happens faster than the loop between the cortex and spinal cord. That means when you feel something, say, a gentle breeze on your skin, signals from the nerves in your arms race up the spinal cord to the cortex, where they're processed and then sent back down to the thalamus, which then sends signals back to the brainstem to relax your muscles. By the time those signals make it from your brain to your arm, the breeze has already been there and gone. So why would it be beneficial for that signal to take such a roundabout route? Well, it turns out that taking this longer route activates the right networks in the brain. In other words, the brain needs the thalamus to select the right information to send to the cortex. When it receives input from the cortex, the thalamus only passes along stuff that's relevant to what the brain is currently doing. Say, you're sitting in a chair. Your thalamus is going to pass along signals related to the feeling of the chair on your skin, the sensation of your weight being supported, and the sound of nearby birds tweeting at the same time. It is going to filter out the sensation of your clothes rubbing against your legs and the hum of the refrigerator a few feet away. The cortex is essentially a big processing center, but it needs the thalamus to tell it which problems to focus on and which ones to ignore. Once the cortex receives the relevant information, it passes on a signal back down to the thalamus, telling it to relay even more of that type of information. So the cortex and thalamus work together to turn low-level sensory information into conscious experience. But this still does unexplain how those physical signals in the thalamus give rise to the experience of, say, feeling a breeze. But by studying model organisms like fruit flies, researchers have figured out that it's all about the timing of signals. In flies, there's a circuit of neurons that controls the animal's state of being awake. Some of these neurons have their activity turned on when the fly is awake, and some are turned on when the fly is asleep. These neurons send signals at different rates when they're active, slow during wakefulness and fast during sleep. By manipulating these circuits, researchers could change the state of the fly. Flies with neurons that fired more slowly became more awake. Flies with neurons that fired more quickly fell asleep. This suggested that the rate of neuronal firing could be a kind of code that the brain uses to communicate between neurons. And studies in mice have shown that the timing of signals matters too. Mice with regular, predictable intervals between action, potentials, or pulses of neurons were more awake, while mice with irregular intervals between action potentials were more likely to fall asleep. So it seems like it's not only what the brain is doing, but also when it's doing it that creates conscious experience. And when you put all of this together, the picture that emerges is this. As the brain develops, new networks of neurons come online. These networks use the thalamus as a middleman to communicate with the cortex, the brain's wrinkly outer layer. Initially, these networks are noisy and chaotic, but then the thalamus begins to integrate the activity of these networks, smoothing out the chaos and creating more predictable patterns of activity. This integration allows the brain to process information efficiently, which may be key to the emergence of consciousness. And while this might seem like a simple explanation for a really complex phenomena, it's worth remembering that consciousness isn't simple. Indeed, no one has ever been able to define what consciousness is, though some researchers define it as a property of certain systems that are able to take in information from the environment and use it to make decisions. If that's the case, then perhaps the real mystery isn't so much how the brain creates consciousness as why it would want to. After all, being conscious makes us vulnerable. If you're conscious, you're aware of your surroundings. Yes, but you're also aware that you exist and will eventually die. A non-conscious brain wouldn't have to deal with any of that. So maybe it's more energy efficient to be little more than a blob of cells. But obviously we aren't blobs of cells, at least not most of the time. So there must be some benefit to consciousness. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out what that benefit is yet. But that hasn't stopped people from wondering since, well, forever. In ancient Greek philosophy, the question of why we're conscious was considered a central question in metaphysics. There was even a school of thought called the doctrine of the mean that argued that everything in the universe strives for an optimum level of consciousness. Because of our unique ability to be self-aware, humans have an especially strong tendency to seek out optimal consciousness. According to this way of thinking, drugs, sex, and food are all ways of increasing consciousness to maximize our happiness. So while we might be getting closer to understanding how consciousness works, the question of why we have it might be with us for a long time yet. So how did we get from here to here? The history of ideas about consciousness. Want to learn more about the history of science? Check out our series, Science Has a History, and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this one. And a huge thank you to our patrons for supporting our work. Without them, we wouldn't be able to bring these videos to you. And you can help us keep these videos free for everyone by supporting us